The wind carried a faint cry across the desert plain, and Apache's hand instinctively hovered over the hilt of his knife before he even saw her. He had lived alone for years. His only companions the howling coyotes at night and the endless stretch of sun-baked earth that rolled toward the horizon. The small cabin he built with his own hands had walls thick with years of dust and smoke, the kind that clung to clothes and skin, marking a life of solitude. He had sworn he would never let another soul near him, not after the betrayals of the past. And yet, there she was, a woman, barely conscious, slumped against the rickety wooden gate of his property. Her hair was dark, tangled with dust and morning dew, clinging to a pale face streaked with dirt. Her clothing was torn, as though she had been dragged through brambles or fought her way through a storm, and every shallow breath she took seemed to cost her the last ounce of strength in her body. Apache approached slowly, careful not to startle her. The woman's eyes flickered open, green and terrified, and he felt an unexplainable tug in his chest, a pull he hadn't felt in years. You need help," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She tried to nod, but her head fell sideways. Without a second thought, he hoisted her in his arms, ignoring the ache in his muscles. The wind whipped past him as he carried her into the cabin, a place that had been his fortress of isolation, now transformed into a sanctuary for a stranger. He laid her on the cot near the fireplace, dragging over a threadbare blanket. Apache worked quickly, ripping strips from his own shirt to wipe the dirt from her face and checking for injuries. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, and the warmth of the fire seemed to coax color back into her cheeks. "Name," he demanded, kneeling beside her. She blinked up at him, hesitant, as though the very act of speaking would drain her life away. Elowen," she whispered. Apache frowned. Strange name, old-fashioned, like something out of a storybook his mother might have told him long ago. There was something fragile in the way she said it, yet beneath it lay a spine of quiet resilience. He had seen women who fought for survival, but she seemed different. Not desperate, not weak, just worn, as if life had dragged her across 100 miles of hardship. And she had finally fallen. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, a scent he had grown to love over the years. He built fires for warmth and protection, yet tonight, watching her shiver under the blanket, he realized he had never used one to guard someone else. His solitude had been a choice, but helping her, protecting her felt inevitable. Hours passed. Apache found water from the well and a little food, enough to coax her strength back. She murmured incoherently at first, then began speaking in fragments, telling him that she had fled a town overrun by greed and violence, that men had come for her for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Apache didn't ask questions, only listened, because he understood more than anyone how life could strip a person down to survival. At dusk, the desert sky ignited with streaks of orange and crimson. Elowen stirred on the cot, slowly sitting up and brushing the dust from her torn dress. Her green eyes, now alert, met his, and for the first time since she appeared, she smiled faintly, though the corners of her lips were tinged with sorrow. "You saved me," she said softly. Apache's jaw tightened. "You do the same for me?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of years he'd spent alone. She laughed quietly, a sound that seemed almost foreign in the empty cabin. "Maybe, but I hope I never have to." He studied her for a long moment. Something about her unsettled him, not because he feared she might be trouble, but because she stirred a longing he had buried for too long. The longing to care, to trust, to let someone in. The desert wind howled outside, but for the first time in years, Apache felt the stirrings of hope, fragile yet undeniable, flickering in his chest, and in the shadows of the cabin the night held its breath, as if waiting to see whether this lone man and the woman at his gate could survive not just the desert, but the past that haunted them both. Takoda stood at the edge of the cabin's porch, the fading sunlight painting the desert in strokes of molten gold and deep crimson. Elowen sat quietly inside, cleaning the small cuts and bruises from her arms, her hands moving slowly, methodically, as if the act of tending to herself grounded her in reality. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Takoda could feel her presence through the cabin walls like a heartbeat he had almost forgotten existed. "Elowen," he finally said, his voice low and steady, "you should rest. You've traveled far, and the desert doesn't forgive weakness." She looked up, her green eyes shimmering in the firelight. "I'm trying," she admitted. "It's been days since I had a proper meal, or a bed that wasn't the dirt." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "I don't even know how I made it here." Takoda's gaze softened, though the tension in his jaw remained. He had lived through storms, attacks, and betrayals, but there was something different about Elowen, something unspoken that made him want to shield her, even before he knew her story fully. "You're safe here," he said. "As long as I'm standing, nothing will touch you." A faint smile flickered across her lips, fragile but genuine. She set down the cloth she had been using and stood, her movements cautious yet deliberate. "And why would you care?" she asked, stepping closer. "Why save me when I'm a stranger?" Takoda hesitated. No one had asked him that in years. No one had entered his world without suspicion, without judgment. "Because," he said slowly, "sometimes a man knows when he can't turn away. I couldn't let you suffer alone at my gate." His words were plain, but they carried weight. And Elowen felt it in her bones. She looked around the cabin, simple, weathered, functional. A home built on survival rather than comfort, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the life he had forged for himself. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. "Always have," Takoda replied, his eyes distant. "The world people, they've taken enough. I trust few, but you arrived without asking, and yet I find myself accepting it." His words trailed off, leaving a strange vulnerability hanging between them. A sudden movement outside caught both their attention. Takoda reached instinctively for the bow leaning against the wall. Elowen froze, her pulse quickening. A hawk circled high above, a lone silhouette against the fading sky, and then silence. Takoda relaxed slightly, though his sharp gaze never wavered. "The desert has eyes," he murmured. "Even the wind watches." Elowen shivered, partly from the chill of the evening, partly from the tension she could not name. "I don't know why I ended up here," she confessed. "Men were chasing me. For something I barely understand myself. I thought I could escape, but the desert." Her voice faltered. "It almost didn't let me." Takoda moved closer, placing a steady hand on the small of her back. "Then the desert led you to the right place," he said quietly. His touch was brief but grounding, a promise unspoken. Elowen felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Trust, safety, maybe even hope. Night fell quickly, and the cabin grew colder. Takoda tended the fire while Elowen wrapped herself in a blanket, watching the flames dance. She studied him, the way his muscles flexed with ease, the quiet strength in his posture, the intensity in his dark eyes. There was danger in his world, yes, but there was also protection, something solid in a life she had thought unpredictable and cruel. "I don't know how long I'll be able to stay," she admitted softly, almost to herself. "The men, if they find me." Her voice trailed off, filled with unspoken fear. Takoda knelt beside her, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "Then I'll make sure they don't," he said simply. There was no bravado, only certainty. "Whatever it takes, Elowen. This land, this cabin. My life is yours to share, if you wish." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, seeing not only the fierce warrior who had saved her, but the man beneath the layers of scars and solitude. A storm of emotion swirled within her relief. Gratitude, something deeper, something dangerous to admit. Outside, the desert night hummed with life crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the grasses. Inside, the cabin held a different kind of sound, the tentative heartbeat of two strangers bound together by circumstance, survival, and the fragile promise of something neither of them fully understood yet. And somewhere beneath the starlit sky, Takoda and Elowen both felt it, a connection that was new, untested, and as unpredictable as the desert itself. The desert night pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, its cool air creeping through the cracks, whispering secrets Takoda had long ignored. Elowen sat near the fire, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept glancing toward the small window, half expecting movement in the darkness. The echo of the men who had chased her lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake. Takoda watched her silently, sharpening the edge of his knife with methodical precision. The firelight danced across his scarred chest and the braided strands of his long black hair, giving him an almost mythic presence in the flickering glow. He had been through many storms, faced countless threats. But the tension in the cabin tonight was different. It was not the desert itself, nor the coyotes in the distance, nor even the possibility of raiders. It was her fear, quiet but palpable, threading itself through the air, and he felt it as sharply as if it were a blow. "You haven't told me everything," he said quietly, breaking the silence. His dark eyes met hers, intense and unwavering. Elowen flinched but did not look away. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "Not yet. The men. If they catch wind that I've spoken, they won't stop." Takoda nodded, understanding the weight she carried. He had known secrecy, had lived with it for years, but hers was a different kind, woven with danger, desperation, and perhaps even betrayal. "Then we'll keep it between us," he said firmly. "No one will find you here. I'll make sure of it." Her gaze softened slightly, and for a moment the tension in her shoulders eased. "You trust me," she said, almost a whisper, "even though you barely know me." Takoda allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. "I trust what I see," he replied. "A survivor. Someone who refuses to give up even when everything tells her she should." The wind shifted outside, rustling the tall grasses and carrying a new scent smoke, faint but distinct, drifting toward them from the north. Takoda stiffened, his body already coiled, instinct sharpened over years of surviving the wilderness. He moved to the door and peered out into the darkness. The moon was a sliver above the horizon, casting pale light on the desert that stretched endlessly. Shadows danced among the dunes, and Takoda's eyes narrowed. "Raiders," he muttered under his breath. Elowen froze, her hands clutching the blanket. "Raiders here?" Takoda nodded, his jaw tight. "They don't know you're here yet, but if they wander close, we'll be ready." He returned to the fire, stoking it higher, casting a bright circle of light that painted the cabin in warmth against the creeping threat outside. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "The desert protects no one who doesn't respect it. And tonight, we respect each other." Hours passed. The cabin became a fortress of shadows and firelight. Takoda taught her to listen to the subtle language of the desert, the soft shift of sand, the distant call of an owl, the way the wind changes when danger approaches. Elowen, despite her exhaustion, absorbed every detail, her eyes wide and alert, a mixture of fear and fascination on her face. By midnight, the first signs of movement appeared on the ridge beyond the cabin. Takoda had already positioned himself at the door, bow in hand, arrow nocked. Elowen clutched the blanket, her knuckles white, but she did not cry out. He had trained her, even briefly, to trust the instincts that had kept him alive for decades. "Ready?" he whispered, his voice calm but commanding. She nodded. And he felt a surge of pride, not just for her bravery, but for the way she had begun to trust him. Even in the face of fear, the shadowy figures crested the ridge, unaware that the lone cabin they approached was defended by a warrior who had lived all his life in the unforgiving desert. Takoda's eyes were like coals, glowing with resolve, and the firelight reflected off his tribal jewelry as he raised the bow. Every muscle tensed and ready. "Elowen," he said softly, "stay behind me." She obeyed, pressed close to the wall, her pulse racing. But something in her chest had shifted. The fear remained, yes, but so did a spark of courage, a recognition that in Takoda's presence she was stronger than she had been alone. Outside, the desert held its breath. Inside, the cabin became a crucible of tension, trust, and unspoken connection. The night was far from over, and both of them knew that survival was not just about skill, it was about bond, instinct, and the quiet courage to face the shadows together. And as the first arrow flew silently from Takoda's bow, Elowen realized that the man who had once lived alone had now made room for her in his world and perhaps in his heart. The first arrow had flown, piercing the night air with a whispering hiss before striking a rock just beyond the ridge. Takoda didn't flinch. Every movement was precise, measured, born of years surviving a world that demanded constant vigilance. Elowen's breath hitched, and she pressed herself closer to the wall, feeling the heat of the fire behind her, and the tension coiled like a spring in the room. "They're testing us," Takoda murmured, his dark eyes scanning the desert, muscles taut under the flickering firelight. "Patience. Don't let fear guide your hands." Elowen nodded, though her heart pounded. She had never been this close to violence, never witnessed the raw, controlled power of a man who had lived by the desert's rules for decades. She felt simultaneously terrified and mesmerized. There was something hypnotic about him, his focus, the quiet authority he radiated, the way he moved as if the desert itself flowed through him. The shadows on the ridge shifted again. Takoda's grip on the bow tightened. "They'll try to flank us. You need to stay low and quiet." He gestured toward the corner where she crouched. "Move behind me if they come closer. I'll handle them." Elowen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her own helplessness, but also the stirrings of courage. She realized that survival wasn't just about running. It was about standing your ground, even when fear threatened to paralyze you. And Takoda. He was teaching her not just to survive, but to trust herself in ways she hadn't dared before. The desert night hummed around them, alive with whispers of wind and distant coyote cries. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps on dry sand. Takoda's lips pressed into a thin line, and he signaled for her to remain still. The footsteps grew closer, cautious, deliberate. "Elowen," he said softly, "if they break through, don't panic."
"Follow my lead, always."
She nodded again, biting her lip, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration. There was a strange intimacy in the shared danger, a silent promise that they would protect each other at all costs. Suddenly, a figure darted into view, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Takoda's arrow was already drawn, aimed with deadly accuracy. He released, and the figure stumbled back, a muffled curse escaping into the night. Another followed, and then another. Takoda moved with fluid, practiced motions, each strike precise, each arrow a testament to his mastery and resolve. Elowen's pulse raced, but she could not tear her eyes away. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, caught in a storm of fear, trust, and something more she didn't yet name. Every glance at Takoda revealed a man forged by hardship, yet capable of tenderness. A protector with a quiet soul hidden beneath layers of scars and survival. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, the last of the shadows receded, retreating across the desert. Takoda lowered his bow, his chest heaving slightly with exertion, and turned to Elowen. "You're safe," he said simply. She exhaled, a shudder running through her body, and let herself collapse to the floor, wrapped in the blanket. You saved me," she whispered, awe and gratitude in her voice. Takoda knelt beside her, his dark eyes softer now, the intensity of the fight fading into something warmer, quieter. "No," he said. "We saved each other. You stayed. You didn't run when you could have. That takes courage, Elowen. That takes heart." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, and for a moment silence hung between them. The storm of the night had passed, leaving only the quiet crackle of the fire and the faint hum of the desert. Elowen's hand reached out almost unconsciously, brushing against his forearm. Takoda didn't pull away. The touch was electric, unspoken promises traveling through the simple contact. The firelight caught in his eyes, making them glimmer like coals, fierce and warm. "You're different," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like anyone I've ever met." "And you," he replied, "are stronger than you know. The desert doesn't forgive weakness, Elowen, but it recognizes those who refuse to yield." She smiled faintly, and the moment stretched, fragile and potent. For the first time since she had fled her past, she felt a sense of belonging, not to a town, a family, or a place, but to the man who had taken her in, protected her, and shared the fire of the desert night with her. Outside, the desert remained, vast and wild, but inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth had taken root. A bond forged in danger, respect, and unspoken desire, a fire that promised to burn brighter than the one in the hearth. And as they sat together in the flickering shadows, Takoda and Elowen understood whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever men or misfortune tried to tear them apart, they had found something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. The first light of dawn spilled over the desert ridges, painting the sand in pale golds and soft pinks. Takoda sat on the porch of the cabin, arms resting across his knees, watching the horizon. The night's events weighed on him, the skirmish with the raiders, the quiet courage Elowen had shown. But even as the desert held its morning stillness, a new unease stirred within him. Danger, he knew, never rested for long in these lands. Elowen emerged from the cabin, her hair still tangled and her dress torn in places, but her eyes were brighter, more alert. She approached slowly, carrying a small bundle of water and bread. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, sitting beside him. Takoda shook his head. "Sleep isn't for those who need to survive," he replied, voice low, yet not harsh. His eyes scanned the horizon as if expecting shadows to move against the rising sun. "But you should rest more." Elowen handed him the bundle, and for a moment their hands brushed. Takoda felt a warmth spread through him he hadn't recognized in years, an ember of connection, fragile yet persistent. "I've never seen anyone fight like you," she said, hesitating. "It's intimidating and yet reassuring. How do you stay so calm?" He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "The desert teaches calm," he said. "It teaches patience. It tests you again and again. You learn to trust yourself and those who earn your trust." His gaze lingered on her, and he felt that inexplicable pull again, stronger than before. "You're learning quickly, Elowen." She flushed, unsure whether to be proud or embarrassed. "I've had to survive before," she admitted quietly. "But not like this, not in a place where one wrong step can end everything." Takoda nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "The desert doesn't forgive mistakes," he said, his tone thoughtful. but it also gives you a chance to rise each time you fall. And sometimes it brings people together who shouldn't even be in the same world, and yet they are. Elowen's eyes searched his, curious and cautious. Are you saying we're supposed to be here together? Takoda's hand brushed a strand of hair from her face, an almost instinctive gesture, gentle but deliberate. I'm saying, he murmured, that in a land as unforgiving as this, trust and connection are rarer than water. And I don't let rare things slip away. Her breath caught. She wanted to respond, to confess the stirrings of something deep within her chest, but words felt fragile, like breaking glass in her throat. Instead, she nodded, letting her silence speak volumes. The desert shifted around them, a soft breeze carrying the scent of sage and dust. Takoda rose, his movements fluid and controlled, and walked toward the ridge to survey the land. Elowen followed, curiosity mingling with caution. She watched him, the way his muscles moved with ease, the way his gaze swept the horizon with a hunter's precision. There was power in him, yes, but also a patience and steadiness that made the wild seem almost tamed in his presence. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly, her voice quieter than the morning wind. Takoda paused, not turning to look at her immediately. Because, he said slowly, someone had to. And because, when I saw you at my gate, I realized that isolation isn't living. It's hiding. And I don't hide anymore, not when there's a reason not to. Elowen felt her chest tighten. She had run from fear, from danger, from men who wanted to control her life. And yet here, with Takoda, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a sense of belonging, a quiet safety, and a spark of hope she dared not name aloud as the sun rose higher. Painting the desert in sharper light, Takoda extended a hand toward her. Come, he said. The day is ours to survive, but maybe also to understand this. This connection, step by step together. Elowen took his hand, feeling the rough calluses of a man who had fought for every inch of his life. And in that simple contact, a promise formed unspoken but undeniable. The desert was vast, dangerous, and unpredictable, but for the first time, they were not alone in it. Takoda and Elowen walked back toward the cabin, side by side. Their footsteps stirred dust, mingling with the wind, carrying away the remnants of fear from the night and replacing them with a fragile, growing trust. The fire of connection had been lit, and neither of them could ignore it. For the first time in years, the desert didn't feel empty. It felt alive, as if the land itself had conspired to bring two souls together amidst the unforgiving wilderness. And both Takoda and Elowen knew, deep in their hearts, that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as strangers, but as allies and perhaps in time something more. The afternoon sun beat down on the desert with merciless intensity, casting sharp shadows across the rocky ridges and windswept dunes. Takoda stood at the edge of the cabin, scanning the horizon with a trained eye. The night had been quiet, but he knew better than to trust the calm. Danger never rested, and the desert was a cruel teacher for those who lulled themselves into false security. Elowen emerged from the cabin, carrying a small satchel of water and dried meat, her steps careful and measured. The ordeal of the past few days had hardened her resolve, and though the fear lingered beneath the surface, she moved with a new confidence. "Takoda," she said softly, approaching him, Do you ever tire of this life? Always watching, always waiting?" Takoda didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon where the heat shimmered above the sand. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, low, and deliberate. "This life chose me as much as I chose it. The desert teaches you patience and vigilance. You can never truly rest, but you can find peace in the rhythm of survival." Elowen's green eyes studied him, tracing the muscles of his chest, the scars etched into his skin, the long black hair falling across his shoulders, and the tribal jewelry glinting in the sunlight. "I've never met anyone like you," she admitted. "You're a force of nature, yet there's something gentle in the way you care." Takoda finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes softening for the briefest moment. "Gentle, only for those who earn it." "You've earned it, Elowen." The sound of a distant rumble interrupted their moment, and the wind shifted. Takoda's posture stiffened immediately. "Storm," he murmured. "And not just any storm." Elowen glanced up at the sky, the clouds rolling in fast and heavy, dark and foreboding. "We should?" she began, but Takoda cut her off with a firm shake of his head. "No, not yet. There's time, but we must prepare." Inside the cabin, Takoda moved with deliberate efficiency. He reinforced the doors, secured loose boards, and stoked the fire to keep the warmth strong. Elowen helped as best she could, her hands steady, her mind sharpened by the lessons he had taught her. They worked in silence, the tension between them building like a coil ready to snap. Once the cabin was secure, Takoda stepped outside briefly, scanning the approaching storm. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his hair and clothes, but he stood firm, a sentinel against the chaos of the desert. Elowen followed, instinctively placing a hand on his arm. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth amidst the cold gusts that stung their skin. "You're not just protecting me," she whispered, almost to herself. "You're protecting us, together." Takoda didn't reply, only tightened his grip on her hand, grounding her as the first streaks of lightning fractured the sky. The storm hit with sudden fury, sand and wind lashing at them, but the cabin offered a fragile shield. Inside, the fire flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across their faces, highlighting the intensity in their eyes. Elowen pressed close to him, feeling the strength of his body and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Takoda," she said, voice trembling slightly, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "Not if you're here." He lowered his gaze to hers, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Fear is part of survival," he said softly, "but courage is choosing to face it, even when it wants to consume you. And you found it in yourself." The storm raged on outside, relentless and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, a different kind of fire had taken hold. Their eyes met, the tension between them shifting from fear to longing. Takoda reached for her, drawing her close, the heat of his body countering the chill of the wind. Elowen rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady pulse beneath his skin. Feeling the rhythm of strength and protection that had become her anchor, lightning flashed again, illuminating their faces in stark contrast, her green eyes wide and searching, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. And in that moment, the desert storm seemed almost irrelevant, powerless against the growing bond between them. "Elowen," Takoda murmured, voice low and steady, "whatever comes next, we face it together, not just as survivor and protected, but as partners, as something more." Her breath caught, and she lifted her face to meet his, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotions. "Something more," she repeated softly, a promise and a hope wrapped into the words. Outside, the desert raged, but inside the cabin, Takoda and Elowen had found a quiet, unshakable strength. One born not from solitude, not from fear, but from trust, courage, and the fragile beginnings of love forged in the heart of the wild. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air crisp and fragrant, washed clean by the rain. Takoda stood outside the cabin, surveying the horizon. The sand gleamed like gold under the early morning sun, the ridges and dunes softened by the night's downpour. The danger that had threatened them had retreated, leaving only the endless, wild expanse of the desert and a quiet that felt almost sacred. Elowen stepped out behind him. her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders, hair damp and clinging to her face. She took a tentative step toward him, and he turned, his dark eyes meeting hers with the softness she had come to crave. The storm had changed something between them. Not only had it tested their survival, it had revealed the depth of their trust and the quiet strength of their connection. "You kept me safe," she said softly, her voice carrying both gratitude and awe, not just from the men or the desert, but from myself, from my fear. Takoda's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "We saved each other," he replied. "I've lived years alone, thinking the desert was enough. But it's not. Not if someone like you walks into my life." She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I don't want to go back to hiding, Takoda. I don't want to run anymore. Not if it means leaving you behind." His hand reached for hers, rough and strong, yet gentle, enveloping her fingers with warmth. "Then don't," he said simply. "Stay here with me. The desert is ours to navigate together, and whatever comes next, we face it side by side." A silence fell between them, profound and tender, as if the desert itself held its breath. Elowen lifted her hand to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the life he had carved from the harsh wilderness. "I feel alive," she whispered, "more than I have in years." Takoda's gaze softened, the intensity in his eyes giving way to something deeper: trust, admiration, and the quiet stirrings of love. "You should," he said, "because you fought to be here and because you deserve it." The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. The cabin behind them stood as a testament to survival, resilience, and now, a home built not just of wood and fire, but of shared trust. Takoda moved closer, his hand brushing a damp strand of hair from her face, and Elowen leaned instinctively into the gesture, the warmth of his body grounding her. "Takoda," she murmured, voice trembling slightly. He lowered his forehead to hers, eyes locking, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. Their hearts spoke in the silence, a language forged in fear, hope, and the intimacy of shared struggle. The desert, once a symbol of isolation, had become the place where they had found each other. "I promise," he whispered, "that I will protect you, not because I have to, but because I want to. And not just from danger, from loneliness, from fear, from anything that might take you away from the life we can build together." Tears shimmered in Elowen's green eyes, tears born of relief, trust, and the realization that she no longer needed to face the world alone. "I don't need to be afraid anymore," she said softly. "Not with you?" Takoda's hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing gently over her skin. "Then stay," he urged. "Stay here with me. This desert, these mountains, they are ours. But more than that, so are we, together." Elowen closed the distance, resting her forehead against his, letting the warmth of their shared breath and presence fill the space between them. The bond that had begun at a gate in the middle of nowhere had grown through storms, danger, and nights of whispered fears until it was unbreakable. Tempered like steel, the sun rose higher, casting light over the dunes and painting the desert in brilliant hues. Takoda and Elowen stood together, hands entwined, hearts aligned, facing a world that could no longer touch them, not because the danger had passed, but because they had found in each other a strength stronger than fear, a shelter stronger than any cabin. "Together," Elowen whispered. "A vow as much as a promise." "Together," Takoda echoed, voice deep and unwavering. And in the vast, endless desert, under a sky washed clean by rain, they knew finally, irrevocably, that they had found not just survival, but life, and in that life, each other. The wind carried their quiet laughter across the dunes, and the desert, once a place of solitude, now bore witness to a love forged in fire, tested by storms, and strengthened by trust. For Takoda and Elowen, the desert was no longer just a wilderness, it was home. And they had each other to face everything that lay ahead.